So inquiring minds want to know, how would a debate between myself and Wes Huff go? Now, I'm not able to play the video because every time I use one of Joe Rogan's videos, I get demonetized. But on our lives that we have on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday on Facebook and YouTube, many people were asking questions about this interview between Wes Huff and Joe Rogan. At the time frame yesterday, I had not seen it. So I took a little time today to go and look at it. So how would a debate between myself and Wes Huff go? Well, I can give you an idea of how my side would go. I can't necessarily say exactly what Wes Huff would say. But based on the comments that he made towards Joe Rogan and the claims he made, I can tell you what my response would have been. So during this interview, Wes Huff decided that he was going to, and one of the parts I found interesting, that he was going to validate Christianity and the crucifixion of Jesus based on an artifact called P52. Now, for those who do not know, P52 is a small scrap of papyrus that was found in Egypt that validates that the book of John existed in Egypt somewhere around the 2nd century. And most scholars place it in this early 2nd century around 129, 130, 140, somewhere around in there. Some even place it as far back as around 169. Now, in order to validate that this is a document that has some level of authenticity, Wes Huff decided that because Luke and John were not written by eyewitnesses, but that they interviewed eyewitnesses, he has to place this document in the mid-1st century at best. Now, in order for him to do that, he made the statement that this document was written by John in and around the time frame, had to be in and around the area of Ephesus, and that because of how information traveled during that era, that this information could have taken 50 plus years in order to reach Egypt, which then makes it seem like it's 2nd century, but you need the time for it to travel to these areas in order for it to happen. Well, this is just simply not true. If he understood it, or if he would, and I'm sure he does, he knows that the Roman roads that were in place throughout the Levant and Egypt and all around the Mediterranean that was built by the Romans, which allowed for them to conquest in the way that they did and move information as quickly as they did. This was the marvelous invention of the Romans, of their Roman roads and their concrete. The actual time frame that it would have taken information to travel from Jerusalem to Egypt was 3 days. 3 days. The amount of time from Ephesus would have been just a little bit longer. So, how much time does it take? Years? Does it take decades? No. How quickly did Christianity then spread into Egypt between that time frame of the so-called crucifixion and the 2nd and 3rd century? Well, the information traveled pretty quickly. We have documentation that Christianity was in Egypt in and around the late 1st century and into the 2nd century. It was already there. Now, because people had traveled from there due to persecutions of the Jewish people and as well as some of the Christians, because it was mainly Jewish people who were persecuted during the 1st century. The Christians really didn't start being persecuted until the 2nd century. Now, I know many of you are going to cite Nero and the writings of Tacitus. We'll get to Tacitus a little bit deeper, but Tacitus is writing around 120, around that time frame. So he's writing very late during a time frame when the Claudio Julians had many writings of propaganda against them, since the Flavians were now the dynasty that was ruling Rome. So we can't verify that Nero actually persecuted Christians. There is only the writings of Tacitus, and we will talk about how Tacitus cannot necessarily be trusted as far as it being authentic information. But if you take one part of Tacitus, you got to take all of it. But we'll get back to him in a minute. So these writings that he's tried to place in this era, first thing is you have to realize that none of the Gospels were given names until around 180. And I believe it was Irenaeus who was the first to name them the book of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. It is well understood that John and Luke were not eyewitnesses, but it is accepted by people who are apologists and who need confirmation bias that they went and they interviewed these people. So Wes Huff's attempt to place this in the mid-1st century is an attempt to say that they had the accessibility to interview people in the mid-first century and saying that it was impossible for that information to travel. Well, that's just simply not true. Because according to the story, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were able to travel from Jerusalem to Egypt within 3 days, and this supposedly happened around 0, then it is easily plausible that if this was written in Ephesus, that information would have been able to travel to Egypt within a week. So it does not take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades. You cannot force it to be written in early first century, because the information that we do have about P52 suggests that it was written in the 2nd century. And since it could have easily been copied and taken to Egypt in the 2nd century, it's plausible. So you can't definitely call it fact. Is it possible that it was written in the mid-first century? It's possible. But we have 0 evidence that that is the actual thing that happened. Now, back to Tacitus. Since Tacitus is the one that they like to throw up, and Tacitus said that in around 120 that there were Christians who worshiped this Jesus, who was persecuted by Pilate, because John, this scrap of John on the backside does suggest and say that Pilate was persecuting one of the Messiah types. Well, Tacitus also wrote about the fact that while Vespasian was in Egypt, before he came and took over it and became the emperor of Rome, that he healed a man with a messed up hand. He healed a man who was blind. And this was done through the power of Serapis. So if you accept Tacitus' writings to validate Christianity and to validate any aspect of anything, then you have to say that Tacitus, who wrote and verified that Vespasian healed some people by stepping on their hand and spitting in some mud and wiping it on another man's eye and blowing in it, then you have to say that Serapis exists as well. You see, you can't have one over the other. You can't split hairs, and this is what he tries to do. He literally really didn't have any comeback for when Joe Rogan suggested that the people of that era believed in the supernatural. He accepted that people all throughout that era believed in the supernatural. Eclipse, comets, storms, earthquakes. They believed that these things happened through supernatural forces, and that these supernatural forces could have been from Apollo, could have been from Mithra, could have been from Serapis, their worship and belief in Asar, Aset, and any other deities, the Germanic deities that Tacitus wrote about, could have been from any of those deities. And people willingly accepted that because they did not have the scientific knowledge that we have today. And Joe Rogan was making the point of how we wrap our minds around it, because the way that Christians wrap their mind around it is that all of those supernatural things that people believed in from other deities were false, but the supernatural things that their deity performed are all true. And this is how religion works, is that it convinces the mind that what you believe in your God is the one that is true, but all other surrounding deities and beliefs are all false. Yet you have the exact same amount of proof for your deity that they have for their deity. You have the exact same amount of proof of an eclipse happening by Yahweh as you have of an eclipse happening by Apollo. So no matter how you look at it, it's all belief. And that's all that he really has. Because no amount of writing, no amount of trying to claim that they talk to eyewitnesses and not actually having anything from an eyewitness, no amount of that will ever make your statements true. No amount of writing. So therefore, it boils down to what you choose to believe in, because you have zero proof of any of this happening. And there's zero proof of any astrological events of an eclipse happening at the crucifixion. And mind you, he talked about Mary and Joseph going to Egypt. Well, that's only in Luke. It's not in it's not in Matthew. And then the fact of the matter is, they can't be born during the same time frame based on the two books. They're born at totally different time frame with a 10-year gap. And one of them didn't even go to Egypt. So what do you guys think? Always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.